Good evening. We're going to start shortly, if everybody would like to find a seat. Let me take this opportunity to welcome you all to this community forum on the financial forecast for your Columbus City Schools. I'd like to thank the staff here for hosting and welcoming us and even providing cookies. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. I'd like to recognize Board Member Reyes here in the front, Ramona Reyes, and Board Member Dominic Peretti right behind her. And on behalf of all of my colleagues on the Columbus Board of Education, I do want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here tonight to share your thoughts and concerns and hopefully some constructive ideas. And let me start by saying every investment we make as a district is valuable. And behind the dollar signs are the faces of our more than 51,000 students and nearly 9,000 staff. These conversations about potential budget reductions are not meant to discredit the value of any person or program. And if we had our way, we would keep every item listed, but instead we recognize that priorities must be set when the state fails to provide full funding for education. And I hope you appreciate that our process has been data-driven and respectful, and that our board and district leaders are here tonight with open minds and a willingness to have constructive conversations. Staff from the district will be capturing your feedback throughout the night, and that will be shared with the board. And the start of tonight's meeting is actually also being streamed on Facebook Live, so our community members who aren't able to be here with us this evening can follow along. If you're not able to share your thoughts tonight, or you have an idea or concern that comes to you later, please make sure you still share that feedback either online, on the app, by phone, through email or regular mail, or coming to a board meeting to speak in person if possible. So to begin, I'd like to ask District Treasurer Stan Bohoric to run through the numbers of the financial forecast so we all better understand exactly how it is that we got here. And then we'll have our interim superintendent, Dr. John Stanford, launch us into our conversations this evening. And again, on behalf of the entire Board of Education, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. We appreciate your presence. Treasurer.
Thank you, President Baker, and good evening. This evening, my goal is to take you back to 2016 and walk you through some of the assumptions that we made then when we were in the throes of levy planning and doing the October 16 forecast, and how those assumptions have changed since then and have impacted then the October 17 forecast that we're working off of right now. And then also explain to you how we began to look at expenditure line items and considered them for possible reduction, how we categorize them and prioritize them. Back in 16, as we prepared for the levy, we were looking out in the final year of the forecast at that time was fiscal year 21. And we planned for the levy under certain revenue and expenditure assumptions such that our target was to hit a zero balance in fiscal year 21. And we had in that levy plan the addition of about 325 positions. And we also, and this is a major revenue assumption, assumed that state revenue would continue to grow at 7.5% each year. As you may know, the state revenue that we receive is capped each year. There's a calculation and a formula that yields one number, but through the budget process at the state level and the allocation of dollars to K-12 education, they don't give us all of the dollars that come out of that calculation. They put a cap on that. There are quite a few districts here in Central Ohio that are on the cap. Other districts around the state actually receive the formula amount, and then there are other districts in the state where the formula would indicate that they would actually have a decrease in state revenue from year to year. But those districts are placed on a guarantee. So you see there's like 3 groups of school districts around the state that have different impacts from state revenue. For the current year, for your information, the cap difference, the difference between the cap and the calculated amount, is approximately $110 million. So the formula says we should receive $110 million more than we do. So back in 16, we did make that assumption. In the October of 16 forecast, we could not assume the passage of the levy. So once it did pass in November, I revised the forecast and presented to the board in December for approval. This is simply the cash balance line after the passage of the levy. And as you can see that although expenditures do exceed revenue in each one of those years, we stay positive until 2021. And while that shows a $17 million deficit, keep in mind that we have an over $800 million operating budget. And through typical conservative forecasting, where actual revenues tend to exceed our estimates over time, and actual expenditures tend to run a little bit under our estimates, we usually generate positive cash flow. So when I saw this, I was not concerned about that. It would work itself out. And I realize that's a large number, but we have a very large budget. After we approved this, felt very good about the passage of the levy and where we were financially, we got into the January-February timeframe of 2017, where the state began to have discussions about its next biennial budget, which would be fiscal 18 and fiscal 19. At that time, some of the rumblings out of the State House involved cap growth anywhere from no growth, 0% growth, to 5.5% growth. The governor's proposal was plus 5%, and at the time we went to prepare the May 17 update to the forecast, we utilized the number of plus 5%, which reduced our state revenue. A month after we adopted that forecast, the state adopted their biennial budget, and the cap increase to us was only plus 4%. So we went from an assumption in 16 of plus 7.5, compounded over a 4 to 5 year period, and ended up from the state having to use a 4% compounded number over the next 4 to 5 years. When that occurred, this is what happened to our forecast. As you can see, 21 dropped down to 89 million deficit, and 22, because we've moved a fiscal year to the next fiscal year 22 rolls into our 5-year picture, and that deficit number is the one we've been referencing of 224 million. So the biggest change that occurred since 16 and our levy plan is the change in our assumptions about state revenue, given the actual results that we have for this current biennium. This biennium again runs for the current fiscal year, fiscal 18, and for next fiscal year 19, and we won't know what the next state budget is. So we, like we did in the last forecast, assume that that will continue at 4%, but this will be a subject of discussion in the next couple of months as we prepare a May update and to see whether or not we want to continue to use that assumption in the out years. So this is where we are. Some goals we felt that the board had set in looking at possible reductions. Number one, we would keep the promises for the additional positions that we had in the levy, the 325. Some of those came on in fiscal 17, some came on in 18. We still have 19, 20, and 21 to go. So, but we would keep those promises to add positions. We would look at addressing the deficits such that we would not need to be back on the ballot for an operating levy until 2020 at the earliest. And lastly, the reductions would not impact the classroom and programming as much as possible. As administration began to look at all of our budgetary line items, we wanted a way to organize our thoughts, and we began to think of the budget line items in terms of this matrix. On the one hand, we would look at an expenditure line item and ask ourselves, is this required for us to do, or is it not required for us to do? And required could be, is it state law? Is it within board policy that requires us to do this? As an example, so there are dimensions of that, who requires what. Secondly, we wanted to look at the return on our investment, and that return on investment, obviously, very simplistically, could be high or low. And the return on investment could be qualitative, or it could be quantitative. And so we use this matrix, if you will, to organize our thoughts, to begin to evaluate which items were more likely to be reduced, which items would be more likely to be kept. Early on in our process, the federal government was also having its share of issues. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead a slide. So here we are, 224, and I wanted to remind everybody that our target really should not be 0 at the end of a forecast. We really, for best practices, should maintain a 30-day cash balance throughout the forecast. Again, a large number, but this is a large budget, and that target is 80 million. So you might hear us talk about, well, I know the deficit projected 224, but for planning purposes, it's really about 304 million that somehow we have to address that to get to this target, if at all possible. So this is where I started just a minute ago. Early in our discussions, the federal government was having their own issues of trying to stay open. And when they did finally pass a continuing resolution, a provision of that continuing resolution was a delay in what's referred to as the Cadillac tax. Cadillac tax is a provision within the Affordable Care Act, and it is a tax on certain high-valued health care programs, and we are subject to that. So when we found out that that was a delay, I went to the forecast to push those numbers out several years. As you can see now, the modified cash balance would indicate a deficit that we have to address of about 212 million. So we picked up about 12 million in that delay. Additionally, for planning purposes, when we looked at reductions, we know that our conservative forecasting should yield some positive cash flow over the years. We estimated that about 15 million a year. So for 4 years, we figured we could pick up about 60 million. So we added that in here. So we went from 212 down to 152 as our target. Now, I might not change our conservative nature in forecasting, but when we look at expenditures, and I'm fairly confident that we'll have those positive cash flows, just like I said that a $17 million deficit might not raise my eyebrow because we'll pick that up in those positive cash flows. Here too, we wanted to factor that in so that we now have to address just a $152 million deficit, not the 224. Lots of numbers, but what I want to try to convey to you is that we worked our way through this and looked at various other factors before we got to making reductions. After going through some 400 line items and prioritizing them, developing the list that you'll see before you tonight and has been presented to the board of 21, I think it's 21.5 million in reductions. If we factor that into the forecast, then our revised picture at this point in time would get us positive out to 21. We would go negative in 22 of about 68 million. And if you wanted to hit the $80 million cash balance target, we're still looking at about 148 million to address one way or the other. So, just to remind you of some of the assumptions that we made up to this point and all the factors that we've included as we got to this list of 21 million. First and foremost, we wanted to try to meet the board's priorities of keeping our levy promise on adding FTEs as full-time equivalents, so adding the positions that we had promised in the levy, that we would not have a levy before 2020, a new operating levy until calendar year 2020, and that we would try to minimize the impact on academic program. We have made no other changes to our assumptions from the October forecast in terms of revenue. We assume that the Cadillac tax will be delayed and remain delayed as it is proposed and adopted by the federal government. We've kind of learned that sometimes the feds can give you something and then take it away. But it's important to remember that that $12 million we assume will always stay delayed, that our conservative forecast will in fact yield a positive cash flow of about $15 million a year, and that the reductions we make in the coming school year for fiscal year 19 will remain in force through the life of this forecast to 2022, so that we wouldn't reduce one year and add them back. And so that's why if we start now, this is where we felt we got the biggest bang for the buck, if you will, in terms of doing reductions. Doing something now, you get 4 times that effect. $1 million reduced now gets you $4 million over the life of the forecast. So it's important that these reductions that we make remain in force for the life of this forecast. And also, as we talk about this, that we keep in mind that we do have a desire to hit a 30-day cash balance at any point in time during our forecast period. So those are the assumptions, where we were in 16 and what happened that drove our forecast into this deficit position, and why we had to come forth with some recommendations on possible reductions in the amount of $21 million. And you'll be able to certainly go around and see those this evening and ask questions. So with that, I'll turn the podium over to Interim Superintendent Dr. John Stanford, and he'll have more for you this evening. I'm supposed to.
Good evening, everyone. Oh, my goodness. Let's try that one more time. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. All right, that's a little bit better, but I'm not going to drag it out. That was still kind of Well, thank you all very much for coming out this evening. And you all didn't have to sit way in the back. You could have come up front and filled up the first couple of rows here. But tonight, we are inviting you and our community, as our community, to talk with members of the district's leadership team who have identified the potential budget reductions that you will see this evening. These budget reductions would take effect as part of the 2018-2019 school year. As we have said all along, reductions of this magnitude is not a one-cut-fits-all solution. Overall, though, our team grouped these proposed reductions, and let me emphasize, they're just proposed reductions at this time, around 3 action items. First, we looked for opportunities where we could reduce costs but not eliminate certain supports. What does this mean? Well, it means that there are several initiatives, especially within the Academic Services Office and in our administrative offices, where funding would be cut by 50% or more starting next school year. But these specific activities and district-wide supports would still be offered to our students and for our staffs. Yet they would receive dramatically reduced district investment. Second, we identified a number of district-level responsibilities and staffing positions which we could reallocate back to the school building level. For covering the extra costs of field trips and lunchroom monitors to providing media technology support in the classroom, the district will now look to principals to identify resources within their building budgets and their teams to account for these types of needs within our school buildings. Third, there are several proposed reductions that realign many of our operational services to minimal levels and realign certain academic offerings to reflect state-mandated requirements. To be clear, in a budget predominantly driven by personnel expenses, which is about 85% of our general revenue fund, reductions of this magnitude will certainly impact personnel numbers district-wide. So you will see more than 160 proposed FTE reductions this evening. This personnel reduction is a combination of certificated, classified, and administrative staff positions. And our hope is that a significant number would be handled through normal attrition at the end of the school year. And by normal attrition, people who are retiring or people who have decided to leave the district for whatever reason. We know that $21 million in proposed reductions would have a significant impact on the district's services to our students and our staff, and they would be felt in every school in every neighborhood across the city. Still, we need to have this conversation tonight in order to maintain our fiscal stability and to be good fiscal stewards of the district's resources. Tonight, we want to hear from you. We want to answer your questions that you have for us tonight. We want to provide clarity on the proposed reductions that we have come up with. And we want to enlist your help and get your insight to help us identify new possibilities or new ideas that you may have. Throughout the night, our team will ask if there are alternative ways in which we could still accomplish the same outcomes, but perhaps we do them in a little bit more efficient and cost-effective way. And we'll ask you if you can think of any additional everyday savings that could be implemented either in the classroom, at the building level, or at the district-wide level. In a moment, I'll invite you to join our administrative team in breakout sessions where you can learn more and provide your insight and feedback. But first, let me give you a little bit of an overview of how the evening will progress. So we're almost to 6:25, and what we will do in about a few minutes is that we will break you out into 3 different groups, and you can self-select what group you want to go to. But you're free to move about throughout the evening. You don't have to stay within one group. So first, leading our first breakout session on proposed reductions in academic services will be our Chief Academic Officer, Alicia Gillison.
Good evening. Good evening.
Well, you said good evening her better than you did some.
It's the way you say it, sir.
Oh, okay. All right. So Ms. Gillison and her team will be right here in this room on that side of the cafeteria. And you see on the walls, in each of the breakout session rooms, there will be these posters in each room, and these posters list the proposed budget reductions, but they also list those items that we considered but did not recommend to the board on January the 30th. The items that you see yellow highlighted are those items that we did propose to the board on January 30th as a potential budget reduction. Next, to answer your questions about our district operations and our accountability measures, including questions about transportation, building services, and school choice, will be our Chief Operations Officer, Mr. Maurice Oldham. Good evening. Good evening. Man, I'm starting to feel jealous. Boy, I tell you. And accompanying Mr. Oldham will be our Executive Director for the Accountability Office, Ms. Felicia Lyons. I'm starting to get a complex up here, I'm just telling you. That group, with Mr. Oldham and Ms. Lyons, will be in room 141, which is right here in the doorway that's opening in the room to the left. Finally, all other proposed budget reductions will be addressed by our budget director, Mr. Scott Gooding, and he's in the back of the room. Raise your hand again, and you better not say good evening, though. We will try, Mr. Gooding and his team will try to answer your questions for board services, the budget office, communications, WCBE, which is our radio station, legal services, the offices of the treasurer, the superintendent, and the internal auditor, and all other district-wide services. That team will meet in room 145, which again is through this doorway, but to the right. So room 141 is to the left, room 145 is to the right. Again, you do not have to stay in one breakout session room. Once you've asked your questions and you've got the information that you want from that breakout session, you are free to move to another breakout session and ask questions of that team and get answers to your concerns from that next group. If you are not able to share all of your thoughts with us tonight, or you have an idea or a concern that comes to you later, please make sure to share your feedback with us either online, on our app, on the phone, through email, through snail mail, or in person if possible. And on the screen here are the different addresses, if you will, that you can provide that information to us. The website address, the way that you can provide it by texting or using our app, or by calling 365-8888. We've given everyone here tonight information on how to share your input on these budget reductions, and that's the little cutout sheet that you should have received at the door. We encourage you to join in by using those vehicles to submit your ideas and your suggestions. So, without any further delay, we'll have a short break as we transition to the breakout rooms. But again, on behalf of our Board of Education, thank you for sharing your voices and your feedback. Once we go into the breakout rooms, we want to get started around 6:45 with the discussions, and you will not come back to this room at the end of the evening. We will adjourn from the breakout sessions around 7:45, 8 o'clock. Okay? All right. Thank you all very much for coming, and we will see you in the breakout rooms.